only knows this on his leg.
Still in. What do they say about that? You gotta go back for it.
Are you back? Does it hurt or just numb? We'll give him some therapy to probably straighten that out, right? I hope. Oh yeah? I never really liked that character. He's cute, but I never really cared for him. Good evening. I'm Graham Allison, former Dean of the school and current Director of the Center for Science and International Affairs. On behalf of Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, I'm pleased to welcome you to a special forum co-sponsored by the Institute of Politics and the Center for Science and International Affairs. Our topic tonight is Vietnam, specifically former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's important recently published book, In Retrospect, The Tragedy and Lessons of Vietnam. In the preface, Secretary McNamara states his thesis succinctly, and I quote, "We of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations who participated in the decisions on Vietnam acted according to what we thought to be the principles and traditions of this nation. Yet we were wrong, terribly wrong. We owe it to future generations to explain why," close quote. The attempt to learn lessons from case histories of public policies past, both our successes and our failures, is one of the principal objectives of this school of government. Robert McNamara's book thus intersects with an important ongoing enterprise here at this institution. This book, Secretary McNamara's Presence, and what promises to be a spirited evening of debate and discussion, is in the best tradition of this school. An issue of great significance, engaging the mind and the heart and the gut, controversial, not just for the sake of controversy, but because differences of judgment matter so much. All these stand as stark reminders that in matters of public policy, the stakes are often profound, including life and death, freedom and justice, for thousands, indeed even hundreds of thousands of individual human beings. Lessons of Vietnam really matter because they weigh heavily in the mind of the public and of our leaders as they face choices today, whether to attempt to restore democracy in Haiti, whether to intervene or alternatively duck issues like genocide in Rwanda or Burundi, whether to avoid a quagmire in the former Yugoslavia on the one hand, or to respond to a moral imperative to prevent mass violence in Bosnia on the other. As an institution of learning, our central objective tonight is to debate lessons learned. Are the key lessons presented in Bob McNamara's book correct or not? Given the distinguished members of our panel and this audience, I'm sure this will be the focus of vigorous debate, including some sharp differences of opinion. At the same time, anyone who's been reading the press or watching television lately knows this subject, coming at this time, in this form, has unleashed a torrent of passion. Many students at Harvard today find that passion somewhat surprising. As I was mentioning to Bob at dinner, a student said to me recently, "What is all this passion about?" All this is ancient history, okay? By which he meant it happened before he and his friends were born. But for a large number of Americans, including many of us here tonight, Vietnam was a formative experience. Those of us who lived through it and lost friends and loved ones in it cannot help but taking it personally. For American society, this remains a defining trauma, one with which we've mostly tried to deal by trying to forget it. Thus, in returning to this issue, Robert McNamara's book reopens old wounds, releasing an outpouring of emotions, anger, sadness, shame, confusion, indeed angst. We can only hope that this painful process will, over time, contribute to the emotional healing as well as the intellectual enlightenment of our society and government. The symbiosis of the head and the heart, especially in matters of public policy, is a complex matter. Gandhi once observed that what disturbed him most was the hardness of the hearts of the educated. A good lesson for all of us at a school of government. Now, to conclude here, in Forrest Gump style, our story tonight weaves in and out of this university's history, including specifically the history of this school. President Kennedy, for whom this school was named, first sent troops to Vietnam. McGeorge Bundy, Dean of Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences, served as Kennedy's National Security Advisor. Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, a graduate of the Harvard Business School. Secretary McNamara's principal assistant Secretary of Defense with responsibility for Vietnam, the late John McNaughton, a professor at the Harvard Law School. And the list goes on. David Halberstam's book, The Best and the Brightest, indicts elite institutions, including Harvard specifically, of which David is a graduate, for arrogance and ignorance in the errors that brought us our longest war and our first defeat. At the same time, vigorous opposition to the war, voiced by many Harvard students of that era, played a role in bringing this war to an end. In the late 1960s, as Robert Kennedy began thinking about his brother's legacy and about what became the Institute of Politics here, and ultimately the John F. Kennedy School of Government, his most intimate circle of advisors included Bob McNamara, Ted Sorensen, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. I can remember as a graduate student some of those days and discussions in which one of the central issues was where had the best and brightest gone astray, especially in Vietnam. Certainly hard-headed cost-benefit analysis was not enough. What could be done to offer better preparation for positions of responsibility in public policy and management? Those remain central questions for this school today as it seeks to fulfill its mission, and it's especially fitting, therefore, that Bob McNamara, who's played so central a role in so many earlier stages of this drama, has returned here to Harvard for serious discussion of these questions tonight. Bob McNamara is a graduate of Berkeley and the Harvard Business School before serving in the U.S. Air Force from 1943 to 1946. He joined the Ford Motor Company, where he rose to become president. In 1961, he became President Kennedy's Secretary of Defense and continued serving in that position under President Johnson. In 1968, he assumed the presidency of the World Bank, where he served until 1981. And the rest of that is history, so let's all join in welcoming tonight Robert McNamara.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Graham, for your warm words. As Graham has indicated, and as I don't have to tell you, the publication of this book has indeed generated a storm of interest and discussion, and it's led to a flood of questions. I want to try to address 4 of the questions in my opening remarks, and then I'll be happy to try to answer the others that I know you will raise. The first 4 that I will speak to are these. Why, after a silence of 30 years, have I chosen to address this subject now? Secondly, with hindsight, did the U.S. actions in Indochina contribute to the security of the West, as many believed at the time, and some still do, or were they a costly failure? And thirdly, if the latter, if they were a costly failure, how can one account for the errors of judgment which caused it? And finally, as Graham emphasized, most importantly, are there lessons which can be drawn from our Vietnam experience, which the U.S. and the world can apply to relations among nations in the 21st century? First, why do I write now? Graham quoted from the book, and I want to read because I want to add a sentence or two to what he quoted. But this is the basic reason. We of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations who participated in the decisions on Vietnam acted according to what we thought were the principles and traditions of this nation. We made our decisions in the light of those values, but we were wrong, terribly wrong. And therefore, I believe we owe it to future generations to explain why. And I do so because I want Americans to understand why we made the mistakes we did and to learn from them. In summary, I hope to say, here's something we can take away from Vietnam that's constructive and applicable to the world of today and tomorrow. So that's the major reason. But there are several other factors, and I want to mention one. It may seem off the point, but it's a very important factor influencing my decision to write. In recent years, I've come to understand how examination of past confrontations among nations can contribute to avoiding future conflicts in the future. There were 5 extraordinary meetings that took place to review the Cuban Missile Crisis. Took place between the years 1987 and 1992. And these meetings were participated in by U.S., Soviet, and Cuban officials who'd guided their nations during that period. And these meetings underscored for me the point I've just made. We must learn more than we presently know about the origin of confrontations among nations and between nations, and how to stop them once they begin. I think it's now widely recognized that the actions of the 3 countries, Soviet Union, U.S., and Cuba, in October 1962, which, by the way, was about the same time that we in the Kennedy administration were introducing U.S. military advisors into Vietnam. But the actions of these 3 nations brought the nations, and more importantly the world, to the brink of nuclear disaster. Now, none of their leaders intended to create such risks. So the meetings of the Cuban, Soviets, and U.S. officials were focused on the misinformation, misunderstandings, misjudgments that brought events to that point. And I think that such retrospective reviews can indeed provide guidance on how to avoid and how to better manage future confrontations of that kind. I hope this book will do the same. It might even lead to meetings on that subject between the U.S. and the Vietnamese participants. Because the Joint Chiefs of Staff, during the 7 years I was dealing with Vietnam, referred to the use of nuclear weapons on several occasions in connection with that conflict, and because these weapons, nuclear weapons, continue to be a part of our arsenal, and because they continue to be, and I doubt that many of you understand this, but these weapons are not only part of our arsenal, they are part of our contingency war plans today. For that reason, I dealt with the risk of nuclear war in an appendix to the book. If you buy it, I hope you'll read it. I made a statement an evening or 2 ago that I'll pay if you'll buy the book and guarantee to read the chapter, it's the appendix actually, on nuclear risks, I'll pay you to buy the book. Send the bill to me and I'll pay. I really mean this. The risk of nuclear war to the world today and for the 21st century is far greater than I think any in this room realize, and certainly far greater than our people do. Here I only want to say that we're still learning how we vastly underestimated that risk during the Cuban Missile Crisis. 2 years ago, some of you may remember, the Russians in Moscow printed statements made by senior Soviet officials in Cuba at the time of the missile crisis and in Moscow at the time of the missile crisis. And they reported that at that time, October 1962, there were 162 nuclear warheads on the soil of Cuba, including at least 90 tactical nuclear warheads. The CIA at the time said they didn't believe there were any there. And the Soviets stated in Moscow 2 years ago that at the height of the crisis, on Thursday, October 25th, the General Pliev, the Soviet commander in Cuba, sent a cable to Defense Minister Malinovsky in Moscow saying, Malinovsky, I, Pliev, am moving nuclear warheads from their storage sites closer to their launch vehicles. Malinovsky sent that cable to Khrushchev. Khrushchev scrawled approved on the face of it and sent it back to Malinovsky. Now, had not Khrushchev 2 days later, that is to say on Sunday the 28th of October 1962, had not Khrushchev on that date publicly announced that he was going to withdraw those missiles and warheads, I believe that on Monday, the following day, the majority of President Kennedy's military and civilian advisors would have strongly recommended to him that we undertake an attack on Cuba to eliminate them, eliminate the missiles, which we knew were there. We thought the warheads were not. The plans for that attack, which was to be under the command of Cinque Land, Admiral Dennison, called for a first-day airstrike of 1,080 sorties. That was a huge air attack. And that was to be followed by a land and sea invasion involving 180,000 troops. And because we believed there were no nuclear warheads there, we had refused Admiral Dennison's request that our troops be equipped with nuclear warheads. But nobody should imagine that had they gone in there, they wouldn't have faced nuclear attacks by the Soviets. And nobody should imagine that we would have tolerated that without a nuclear response. And we had ways of doing it from the southeastern U.S. And where would it have ended? In utter disaster. Now that risk, that threat remains today. Please read the appendix. Now let me turn back to Vietnam and the second question. With hindsight, did U.S. actions in Indochina contribute to the security of the West? Or were they, as the subtitle of the book indicates, a costly failure? For me, my involvement with Vietnam ended the day I left the Pentagon. That was February 29, 1968. At that time, U.S. fatalities totaled about 17,000. But the war didn't end for the U.S. until our last troops were pulled out 5 years later, by which time our fatalities had increased to 58,000. Our economy had been damaged by years of heavy and improperly financed war spending. The political unity of our society had been shattered, and it wasn't to be restored for decades. Now, were such high costs justified? Dean Rusk, who was a dear friend of mine, an outstanding patriot, a servant of our country in war and peace, until he died December 20 last year. Until he died, he believed the answer to the question, were the costs justified, was yes. And I believe that many geopoliticians living today, including Walt Rostow, for example, who was President Johnson's national security advisor, and including that extraordinary Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, I believe many of these geopoliticians would agree with Dean Rusk today and say the costs were justified. And the reason they would say that is that they conclude that without U.S. intervention in Vietnam, that communist hegemony, both Soviet and Chinese, would have spread farther through South and East Asia and would have taken control of Laos and Cambodia and Thailand and Malaysia, Indonesia, and perhaps even India. And some would go further and say that in that case, the USSR would have been led to take greater risks attempting to extend its influence across and into Western Europe, and they might even have tried in the Middle East to take control of the oil-producing nations. Now, I don't share those judgments, and I'll be willing to tell you why if you wish. But having said that, I want to stress that the danger of communist aggression during the 4 decades after World War II, during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, was very real and very substantial. Most of you in the room have had no experience with that, and we will want to talk about it perhaps in the Q&A period, but it was there. I think during those 4 decades, we often misperceived, and we therefore exaggerated the power of the East and its ability to project that power across the West. But it was real, the threat was real, and to have failed to defend ourselves against that very real threat would have been foolhardy and irresponsible. That said, however, today I question whether either Soviet or Chinese behavior and whether either Soviet or Chinese influence in the 1970s and 80s would have been materially different had the U.S. not entered the war in Indochina, or had we withdrawn from Vietnam on any one of several occasions between, say, 1963 and 1973 when we did. And by the early and mid-1960s, it should have been apparent to those of us who lived after President Kennedy's assassination that the two conditions that President Kennedy laid down as a basis for our introduction to military advisors were not being met and could not be met. Political stability did not exist in South Vietnam, and it could not exist. And the South Vietnamese, even with our training and with our logistical support, were incapable of defending themselves. Now, given those facts, and I think they are facts, I believe today, as I say, we could have withdrawn on any one of several different occasions between 1963 and 73. With hindsight, I don't believe that U.S. withdrawal on any one of those occasions, if it were properly explained to the American people, and if it were properly explained to the world, would have led Western Europeans, as Dean Rusk feared, to doubt the credibility of our guarantee of NATO, or led the Japanese, as Dean Rusk feared, to doubt the credibility of our security guarantees to Japan. But we didn't withdraw. Now, why didn't we? As I've implied by what I said, my associates in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations were an exceptional group of people. They were young, intelligent, well-educated, highly motivated, hardworking, dedicated servants of the nation. Now, how did this group, as Dean said, the best and the brightest that they've been called in that pejorative phrase, how did they get it wrong on Vietnam? How did we? Leave me out of the best and brightest, perhaps, but I was part of the group that got it wrong. Now, what lessons can we draw from that experience which are applicable to the world of today and tomorrow? And that's the story I try to tell in the book. And the story begins on the day after John F. Kennedy's inauguration, January 21, 1961, when I, along with my 8 cabinet colleagues, was sworn in by Chief Justice Warren. And I took the oath of office along with my cabinet colleagues, and that was the proudest day in my life. I was then the 8th and the youngest Secretary of Defense ever. As I say, I was very proud, but at the same time, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of foreboding. And the reason was that 2 days before, the day before President Kennedy was inaugurated, on January 19, we had a long discussion with President Eisenhower. It was his last full day in office. And we dealt with the Indochina problem. Eisenhower had with him his Secretary of State, his Secretary of Defense, and his military assistant. And President Kennedy had Dean Rusk and his Secretary of State, McGeorge Bundy, Doug Dillon, and Clark Clifford as his note-taker. And we covered an immense number of subjects with Eisenhower, but the main focus was on Indochina. Several of the participants in the meeting, including me, prepared memoranda of record. And these and subsequent memoirs of the meeting reflect quite differing views of what Eisenhower advised Kennedy with respect to this crucial issue of military intervention in Southeast Asia. Eisenhower's focus was actually on Laos, but because that was the primary problem at the time, but it certainly referred to Vietnam as well. And Clark Clifford wrote, and these are his words, President Eisenhower stated that Laos is the present key to the entire area of Southeast Asia. And he said if Laos were lost to the communists, it would bring an unbelievable pressure to bear on Thailand, Cambodia, South Vietnam. And Eisenhower stated that he considered Laos, and by implication Vietnam, of such importance that if it reached the state where we couldn't persuade others to act with us, then Eisenhower would be willing, as a last desperate hope, in his words, to intervene unilaterally. And Dean Rusk remembered the meeting largely as Clark Clifford reported it. But my memorandum, which I prepared at President Kennedy's request from notes that I'd taken at the time, suggested that Eisenhower was presenting to us quite a mixed message. And I had the impression he was deeply uncertain about what to do. And I wrote, President Eisenhower advised against unilateral action by the United States. And I noted that he didn't answer Kennedy's direct question. The question was, quote, Kennedy said, what action can be taken to keep the Chinese communists out of Laos? And I concluded by writing, President Eisenhower stated without qualification, if Laos is lost to the free world, in the long run we'll lose all of Southeast Asia. Now Doug Dillon, later, who was president, as I said, later told a scholar that his recollection jibed completely with my notes. But he went a step further, and Doug said that Eisenhower and Herter, his Secretary of State, got an inner satisfaction from laying a potentially intractable problem in Kennedy's lap. And I think Doug's impression was absolutely correct. Eisenhower didn't know what to do in Southeast Asia, and he was glad to leave it to the Democrats. But I can't fault him for handling the problem in that way. The problem had no solution. It was indeed intractable, the way Eisenhower defined it and the way we defined it. And just how intractable it was, our nation would learn to its sorrow over the next 10 or 13 years. I think there's other evidence that Eisenhower felt stumped. It was later reported that in a meeting with his senior officials 3 weeks earlier, he had said although he had kept the U.S. out of Vietnam 6 years earlier at the time of the defeat of the French at Dien Bien Phu, 3 weeks before Kennedy's inauguration, Eisenhower had said to his people, if necessary, we're going to have to go in there unilaterally. Now, would he have done so? I don't know. I don't really think that's the important point. The important point is the decision was ours, not Eisenhower's. And we were wrong. We made the decision. He didn't make the decision. And to demonstrate how and why we went wrong, I review in detail the key decisions that we faced over the ensuing 7 years. And I discuss each of them, what the alternatives were, how we evaluated the alternatives, why we acted as we did, what might have happened if we'd chosen a different alternative. And it's from that review that I identify our failures, and it's from that review that I draw from them the lessons, which I believe will be applicable and relevant to the 21st century. Now I'm going to go through, there are 11 of them. The last chapter is devoted to the lessons. There are 11. I'm going to go through them very, very quickly, in a sense very superficially. But I want you to understand just the outline of my thinking, and then we can get into the questions, and if you wish, we can go further into them. The first point is, we misjudged then, and I think we're misjudging today, the geopolitical intentions of our adversaries. In that case, it was the geopolitical intentions of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, supported by China and the Soviet Union. And we exaggerated the dangers to the U.S. of those adversaries. And I think we're continuing to do that. We were talking at dinner about the defense budget. I doubt that anybody in the room recognizes that the defense budget of the U.S. proposed by the Clinton administration for the years 1977, 78, in constant dollars, is only 3% less than President Nixon's in the height of the Cold War. My God, are we not continuing, as I suggest, today as we did then to exaggerate the dangers to the U.S. of some of these threats? I think so. Second lesson. Second mistake. We viewed the people and leaders of South Vietnam in terms of our own experience. We're still doing that. We saw them as having a thirst for and a determination to fight for freedom and democracy. We totally misjudged the political forces within that country. Thirdly, we underestimated the power of nationalism to motivate a people, in this case, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. We underestimated the power of nationalism to motivate a people to fight and die for their people. Ho Chi Minh said, and I believe he meant it, they would have fought another 10 years. Just a week ago, the Vietnamese completed a study they've been working on for some time of the number of fatalities. I couldn't believe the figure. I heard it over French radio. They say that excluding the South Vietnamese military who were killed, which they didn't have data on, that they believe that 3,200,000 Vietnamese, civilians and military, North and South, were killed. And he said they were prepared to kill another 10 million. I think they were. We didn't believe that. We totally misunderstood the motivation, the dedication of a people motivated by nationalism. Fourthly, our misjudgments of friend and foe alike reflected our profound ignorance of the history, culture, and politics of the people in that area and the personalities and habits of their leaders. We might have made similar misjudgments regarding the Soviets during our frequent confrontations. During the 7 years I was secretary, we confronted the Soviets over Berlin in August 61, over Cuba in October 62, and over the Middle East in June of 67. We avoided wars in all those cases, in part because we had available to us, at the most senior levels of the government, the advice of Soviet specialists, Tommy Thompson, Chip Bolin, George Kennan. They'd spent their lives studying the Soviet people, its culture, its history, their politics, their personalities, and their advice proved invaluable. And I would say that the heroes of the Berlin crisis in 61 and the missile crisis in 62 and the Middle East in 67, the heroes were those Soviet specialists who helped President Kennedy and Secretary Ruskin and myself and the National Security Advisor make the decisions we did. No Southeast Asian counterparts, and this is a statement that I have made, and there's no statement I made over radio, TV, or newspaper interviews in the last 2 weeks since I've been commenting publicly that has drawn more, I'll call it derision, not just disbelief, derision, than this statement. There were no Southeast Asian counterparts for senior officials to consult with during those periods. Fifth mistaken lesson. We failed then, as we have since, to recognize the limitations of modern high-technology military equipment and forces and doctrine in confronting unconventional, highly motivated people's movements. We were about to make that mistake, thank God we haven't yet, in Bosnia. And we failed as well to adapt our military tactics and our political programs to the task of winning the hearts and minds of people from a totally different culture. Sixthly, we failed, and we came damn close to making this mistake in connection with the Gulf War. We failed to draw Congress and the American people into a full and frank discussion and debate of the pros and cons of large-scale U.S. military involvement, in that case in Southeast Asia, before we initiated the action. And seventh, after the action got underway and unanticipated events forced us off our planned course, we failed to retain popular support in part because we hadn't explained fully what was happening and why we had to do what we did. In effect, we had to begin to try to cut our losses and shift tactics and strategy, and the public didn't understand, and they weren't with us. A nation's deepest strength lies not in its military force. It lies in the unity of its people. We didn't have it, and I would suggest to you we probably didn't deserve it, given the way we handled it. Eighth, we didn't recognize that neither our people nor our leaders are omniscient. To this day, we seem to act in the world as though we know what's right for everybody. We think we're omniscient. We aren't. We weren't then and we aren't today. And where our own security is at stake, I'm prepared to say act unilaterally, militarily. Where our security is not at stake, not directly at stake, narrowly defined, then I believe that our judgment of what is in another people's interest should be put to the test of open discussion, open debate, and international fora. And we shouldn't act unilaterally, militarily, under any circumstances. And we shouldn't act militarily in conjunction with others until that debate has taken place. We don't have the God-given right to shape every nation to our own image. Ninth, we didn't hold to the... Well, you can clap, but we're still trying to do it, and that's sad. And I guess one question you could ask is, how do we move from where we are to where we ought to be? And that's very difficult, and I'm depending on you all to play a major role in that. That's why you're here. That's why I'm here talking to you. Ninth, we didn't hold to the principle that U.S. military action, other than in response to direct threats to our own security, should be carried out only in conjunction with international forces who are going to share in the cost. And I don't mean financial cost, although I certainly include financial cost, but I mean primarily the blood cost, the blood risk. In the Gulf, cosmetically, we had support of others, but 90% of the blood loss that the chiefs predicted, thank God their predictions were wrong. They predicted very substantial fatalities in the Gulf. Thank God they're wrong. But had they occurred, 90% of the blood loss would have been ours, and 75% of Japan's oil is imported from the Gulf. 10th, we failed to recognize that in international affairs, as in other aspects of life, there may be problems for which there are no immediate solutions. Certainly no military solutions. Now, for me, that's very hard to say. I spent my life problem solving. I believed every problem had a solution. And I've now come to the conclusion that some problems that sometimes don't have solutions, and particularly not military solutions. And again, I point to Bosnia. I don't believe that Bosnia today has a military solution. And I could cry when I say it, because human beings are being killed. And I'll come to this point of killing human beings again before I conclude. Graham pointed to the genocide in Rwanda. I don't know what the hell to do in Rwanda and Burundi. And I don't think U.S. military force is the answer there. Not today. Earlier, perhaps we could have done something. Today, I just don't see it. And finally, underlying many of these 10 mistakes lay our failure to organize the top echelons of the executive branch to deal effectively with an extraordinarily complex range of problems that we were facing. Political issues, military issues across the globe. Our cities were burning. We were facing the kinds of military confrontations with the Soviets I referred to earlier. We hadn't organized for it. It sounds incredible to you that that's the case. We aren't organized for it today. Churchill drew great attention to the need for a war cabinet if you're facing military operations as complex as those we faced in Southeast Asia. We had no war cabinet. There wasn't a single senior civilian or military official that did nothing but work on Vietnam. Not a member of the chiefs, not a member of the cabinet, not a member of the National Security Council. So those were our major failures. I'm pointing them out, as I said before, because I think these are lessons that can apply to the future. Now I want to conclude. I know I'm running a couple of minutes over time. I'm going to skip some comments I had on the personalities and my feelings toward the persons of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. In quite different ways. I loved and respected them both. But you'll have to read the book for that. But there's one paragraph relating to Johnson I really want you to read. I think it's a wonderful paragraph. Because it captures the contradictions, or I think it does. And I'll tell you what page it's on. I was going to read it to you. It's a wonderful paragraph. It's on page 317. If you buy the book, read that paragraph. But now let me go. Oh, and also you've got to look at the pictures. Peter Osnos, who was here tonight, was my editor. And I say in the acknowledgments, I had 4 competing bids for this book from 4 different publishers, and I chose Times book because of Peter Osnos, and by God, I tell you, it was a wise choice. But I got tremendous help from him. But what I started to say was that he insisted I have a photographic section. So I scrounged around. My wife is dead. The house is the most disorderly thing you've ever seen. But I finally found a batch of photographs, and I wrote a little photographic essay. I contracted for 16 pages of photographs, and they liked it so much they put in 32. But one of them was a wonderful photograph. You just won't believe this. My last days in the government were absolutely chaotic. And the chiefs were going to give me a military honors and all this stuff. And there were going to be a flyover of Air Force, Navy, and Marine aircraft. And the troops were going to march in honors before the president and me. And the president came over to the Pentagon to participate in all this. And I met him in the garage. And I got in an elevator, take him up to my office on the third floor. And you will not believe it. The damn elevator got stuck between the floors. And I thought the Secret Service were going to explode. Here's the President of the United States caught between the second and the third floor in the Pentagon. So they knocked a hole through the elevator, through the roof of the elevator. There was a telephone in the elevator, an emergency telephone. They picked that thing up, and the guy came on the other end, and the Secret Service said, "This is an emergency." The voice said, "You got a full load?" In any event, the point of the story is there's a photograph in the book of Johnson coming up through this elevator well. He looks absolutely Asian. Well, let me get off of that. I was going to tell you a little more about Kennedy and Johnson. They were lovable human beings. I say something in the book about it. But now, in a very brief conclusion, I want to refer to the future in relation to the past. In my earliest memory, and I suspect it's earlier than 99% of the people in this room ever had any memories, my earliest memory is of a city exploding with joy. And the day was November 11, 1918. It was Armistice Day. I was 2 years old. The city was San Francisco. It was celebrating not just the end of World War I, which of course we'd won. It was celebrating the belief, and this was a belief widely held among Americans at the time. It was, of course, President Wilson's belief that we had fought a war to end all wars. And how wrong we were. The human race killed 160 million people in the 20th century. It's the bloodiest century by far in all of human history. But now as this century comes to a close, I think we have an opportunity to view the future with hope. There's no reason why we should replicate that century, duplicate it in the 21st century. The Cold War's ended. George Kennan has said, and I think he's absolutely right, there's no risk in the near term, the next 10, 20 years. There's no risk of conflict between great powers, among great powers. We have the lessons of Vietnam before us. They can be learned, they can be applied. We should see much more clearly than we do, and we should certainly act more forcefully than we are to reduce the risk of nuclear weapons. If we don't, I tell you, the number killed will be far in excess of 160 million. But we are beginning to understand we need to act. We have a much better understanding of the potential and the limitations of multilateral institutions, the UN, the regional organizations, for minimizing and alleviating disputes within and among nations. So don't we have reason, therefore, to believe that the 21st century, while certainly not a century of tranquility, need not witness the killing again of 160 million people by allegedly human beings. Surely that must be not only our hope, but it must be our dream, it must be our objective. Now, some of you may think that these words are naive, simplistic, so idealistic as perhaps to be quixotic. I know that's a rather common view. It's a view of many of my geopolitical friends, the so-called political realist school. But as human beings, as citizens of a great nation, a powerful nation, sufficiently powerful to influence events in the world, can we be at peace with ourselves if we strive for anything less than avoiding in the 21st century the mistakes of the 20th? I think not, and I hope you'll agree. Thank you.
So, thank Secretary McNamara for a terrific tour of a book that deserves careful reading. We have an excellent panel tonight to start the conversation, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. The first member of the panel is the Kenneth Young Professor of Sino-Vietnamese History at Harvard, Huey Tom Ho Tai. Professor Tai was born in Saigon, Vietnam in
Do you really want to say?
48. She received her baccalaureate in Saigon, Vietnam, her PhD from Harvard. Her books include a book entitled Peasant Politics in Vietnam and a forthcoming book entitled Heaven, Man's Will and History, The Origins of the Vietnamese Revolution. She and the second member of our panel currently teach a course at Harvard in the core called America and Vietnam, 1945 to 1975. So please help welcome Professor Tai.
Thank you. I have to say that the CV that you got is slightly out of date. The second book has come forth, and a slightly different title. Now, both Dean Allison and Secretary McNamara have made references to the lessons of Vietnam. I'd like to speak of Vietnam, not as a set of lessons, although I do teach a course on the Vietnam War, but as the country of my birth, and of my ancestors, of my relatives. I've spent the last month or so marking the fall of the city where I was born. That fall will come on Sunday. And as I think about this fall, I have to think about the relatives that fought on different sides of the war. One of my cousins married a woman who was imprisoned in a tiger cage and tortured. And she has a bag full of skin that was shed by herself and fellow prisoners every time the cage was flooded by the wardens. I have relatives, my father, who died in a re-education camp. I have relatives who escaped by boat, and many others who did not make it and perished at sea. And I'd like to commemorate them, as well as the over 3 million dead on both sides of the war, over 3 million on the North Vietnamese side and several 100,000 on the South Vietnamese side. I would like also to remember that there are over 4.4 million acknowledged veterans, that is, veterans of the North Vietnamese side, and many, many more South Vietnamese veterans of the war, as well, of course, as the 58,000 Americans who died and the many American vets. For them, Vietnam is not just a set of lessons. It's a very painful place to have been. I do think that the book that Secretary McNamara has written is a very, very useful book, a very good book, a very necessary book. It's also a very painful book for me to read, particularly at this time, as I try to recall all this death, all this suffering. The Vietnam War was caused by a lethal combination of iron will on the North Vietnamese side and incredible muddle-handedness on the part of the United States. Secretary McNamara's book shows very clearly how muddle-headed successive US administrations were. There was confusion over whether the war was being fought to contain communism and protect vital American interests, and confusion over whether the United States was there to protect democracy in South Vietnam. Time and again, the argument was made that South Vietnamese must fight their own war, that the United States couldn't fight it for them. But South Vietnamese were often confused with South Vietnamese leaders, and peasants don't appear very much in that book. The war to win their hearts and minds, to convince that what the regime they were living under was actually better than communism. A case that could have been made was not made properly. Having lived under the Diem regime and the Thieu regime briefly, I can say that it was not apparent to people in South Vietnam that they really ought to lay down their lives to fight for a regime that was corrupt, undemocratic. We know, of course, in retrospect, that it was far better than the regime that came after 75. But at the time, for South Vietnamese, it was very hard to motivate them. And I don't think that the American administrations made the case, and they continually confuse the South Vietnamese leaders with the South Vietnamese population. And those South Vietnamese leaders also were very difficult to defend. At one point, Secretary McNamara suggests that Diem seemed to be a good enough bet on the ground that he was probably committed to Western values. How did the Kennedy administration know that? Because he had attended a seminary in New Jersey. Now, of course, that's before the movie Priest came out. Now, as I said, the Vietnamese peasantry seems to have ranked very, very low in the decision-making process. When pacification finally came in, the war to win the hearts and the minds of the people, it was fought half-heartedly, and it was, of course, tainted with the excesses of the Phoenix program, under which one of my relatives suffered. There was also the problem of the United States complicity in the Diem coup. Secretary McNamara has repeated the claim that he advanced in the book, that had Kennedy lived, he would have extricated the United States from the war. For me, as a Vietnamese, having lived through the Diem regime and the coup, it's very hard to see how morally that could have been done. Sure, 4 weeks before Kennedy died, he talked about an eventual pullout, talking about perhaps December 63 as the time. But that was 1 week before Diem was assassinated in a coup that was not just condoned by the United States, but hatched in Washington. How could the United States have pulled out, whatever the morality of the war itself, from a situation that it knew going in, having hatched the plot to overthrow Diem, would sow chaos in South Vietnam? I don't think it's a morally defensible action. Again, it's hard to distinguish here between error of judgment, which is what Secretary McNamara suggests was the problem with the Kennedy and Johnson administration, and moral failure. An equally distressing point was that despite grave doubt about the effectiveness of the bombing raids in North Vietnam, those bombing raids were carried out anyway. Anybody who has gone to North Vietnam knows what the toll of those raids were. And those bombing raids changed purposes all the time. At one point, it was to cow the North Vietnamese into stopping the sending of troops and supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But very soon it changed to shoring up the morale of the South Vietnamese leadership, and later on, merely to shore up American credibility. Let's remember all those people who died in the bomb raids. Now, I don't want to say that the moral responsibility for the war in Vietnam lies with the Kennedy, Johnson, and administrations and successive administrations alone. North Vietnam certainly bears an enormous share for the carnage that was visited on the population of Vietnam. And I do want to conclude, after having brought this criticism to bear on Secretary McNamara's book and recollections, that at least the United States, including Secretary McNamara, have faced up to the moral legacy, the lessons of Vietnam, in a way that the Vietnamese leadership itself, as it prepares to mark the 20th anniversary of the city that was renamed Ho Chi Minh City has still not, faced up to. And for that, at least, I'm glad that having been born in Vietnam, I have become an American citizen. Thank you.
The second member of our panel tonight is Harvard's leading historian of international relations, the Charles Warren Professor of History and Director of the Warren Center for Studies in American History. Professor Ernest May's publications include a book entitled The Ultimate Decision, The President as Commander-in-Chief, a second book entitled Lessons of the Past, The Uses and Misuses of History in American Foreign Policy, and if I cite just one additional book, an excellent book that he wrote with another colleague here at the Kennedy School entitled Thinking in Time, The Uses of History for Decision Makers. Professor May and a number of his colleagues teach here at the Kennedy School a course on uses and misuses of history for the purposes of policy making. So it's a great honor to have him as the second member of our panel.
Thank you, Graham. I just want to make three very quick points following my colleague, the eloquent comments of my colleague, Tom Tighe. The first is a quite academic point. It's a criticism of Secretary McNamara's book, which I think on the whole an excellent book, but his reconstruction of what happened in the 60s is, I think, quite clinical and rational, and he looks back and explains the mistakes that were made in judgment and policy. I don't think that the book succeeds in recreating the frame of mind in which those decisions were made. That if you take the episode that he was describing here, which is described in some detail in the book, the transition from the Eisenhower to the Kennedy administrations, here are the best and the brightest, not only of the Kennedy administration, but of the Eisenhower administration. And they sit there and they believe, they say to each other and they believe that the fate at least of Southeast Asia and perhaps of the civilized world hinges on what happens in Laos, a landlocked country of 3 million hamlets, populated by people devoted primarily to singing songs, making love, and raising opium. And there's a theology around it, a set of beliefs which are not recaptured in the book. And it's a little bit like, if you'll forgive my saying so, it's a little bit like a Crusader's memoir written by someone who can't remember why he particularly cared about the fate of Jerusalem. But that's a weakness. It's a terrific book, but I think there is this weakness in the imaginative reconstruction of the period. Second point about the book. I've been trying to think if there are counterparts, and there may be. I cannot think of another book that is like this book in two respects. One, I do not know any other memoir that is as thoroughly researched. And this is, in some ways, it's more a history than a memoir. It very heavily relies on documents. Where there is a document, Secretary McNamara will rely on that in preference to his memory. It's an extraordinarily well-researched memoir, and I do not know of any other memoir that is equally much a confession of error, that is as forthright a confession of error. There are lots of memoirs in which people try to justify themselves and to explain what they did, but I certainly don't know another book that combines these two qualities, of the depth of research and the forthrightness of the confession of error. So I think it is a unique work of history. The last point that I want to make is that and it really just goes from what he was saying in summarizing his final chapter. It is, I think, an extraordinarily useful and wise book. The lessons have been drawn from Vietnam, started being drawn while the war was still going on. They are very powerful. They affected our thinking about the Gulf War. They affect our thinking about Bosnia. There are many different kinds of lessons. They're drawn from many different perspectives. Someone once did a list of 29 different lessons of Vietnam that had been drawn out widely in the public. But most of the lessons that are drawn, like the lesson that we should not intervene in what you can characterize as civil conflicts elsewhere, or the lesson that if we intervene militarily somewhere, we must do so in great force and very quickly. These are prescriptions that may be right or they may be wrong. They really vary. Wisdom depends on the circumstances in which they're applied. But the lessons that he draws in this book are lessons of broad application. They are not this kind of specific prescription. They are lessons about how to think about problems. And I would boil down his 11 precepts into two broad categories. The first is the precept that when we are thinking about any foreign area, any other governmental or organized force in the world that has a different history and a different culture, you need to think about that history and culture and not to project your own values and your assumptions about that they will behave the way you do. You have to think about them in their own context. That is a lesson of universal application. And the second is the general lesson that when we think about doing something in the world, we should always very closely inspect the premises that we're operating on. Look at them very carefully. And he makes the point that these premises were accepted, that they were not analyzed, and I think that proposition is one of universal validity. It's not brand new. Oliver Cromwell once caught it by saying, "I beseech you in the bowels of Christ to consider that you may be wrong." And that's another phrasing of it, but it's a tremendously, and there is finally, there is an implicit lesson in the book, not one of the 11 that he gives, I think, which is, I think, a terribly important lesson because it runs against the conventional wisdom that is taught in this university and around the world about international relations. Because as I read it, he is saying that what his painful voyage with regard to the Vietnam War was a voyage of discovery about the relationship between the government and the people in the United States, and the implicit lesson is that the conduct of foreign policy is not primarily the conduct of relations with other governments. It is primarily a matter of domestic leadership. And that seems to me a tremendously important lesson that this book conveys, and I hope will convey to generations of readers to come. Thanks.
The final member of this evening's panel is a Vietnam veteran, where he served as a Marine from 1968 to 1970, winning a Silver Star. Tom Vallely is a graduate of this school, of MPA, the class of 1983. He served as a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, as an executive assistant to Joe Biden in a short-lived presidential campaign. He is presently the founding director of the Vietnam program here at Harvard's Institute for International Development, which is the most active and substantial program for rebuilding bridges between the United States and Vietnam. And he just has returned from Vietnam this past weekend. So thank you, Tommy.
Graham, thank you very much. I'd like to tell a little bit about what I used to do in Vietnam and a little bit what I do here at Harvard. I used to carry a radio. I was the company commander's radio operator in a Marine infantry company in the Quang Dam, Da Nang region. We didn't use the Vietnamese names to describe these places. It was called I Corps, the Arizona Territory, or Dodge City. As a corporal, I ran the company's communications operation. And if I wanted to light up the sky, I could use canisters and do that. When I was 19, I could make night day. I could call artillery from a number of places, depending on where we were. I could call arc lights for B-52s. I could call the Navy to bomb a North Vietnamese battalion or a village in the An Hoa Valley. We had Huey gunships. spotter planes, and medevacs. I could call anybody I wanted. I couldn't call anybody to tell them that what we're doing was wrong. For a number of years, I had a very hard time talking about Vietnam. It was hard for Mr. McNamara also. Vietnam is an industry, and the industry tries to regulate the debate. The industry has all sorts of organizations, spokespersons, and interest groups. And if you look at the three people that have tried to move the relationship between the United States and Vietnam forward, General John Vesey, Senators John Kerry and McCain, all heroes of the war in Vietnam, they have all experienced harsh criticism from this industry. This industry is going to do the same to Mr. McNamara. In the April 24th, this week's issue of the New Yorker, Neil Sheehan comments on another book, an industry book, that insists the North Vietnamese had killed more POWs than had previously been thought. Sheehan writes, quote, "The book is significant because when accepted at face value, it adds, as so many similar books we have seen in the past, another twist in the already twisted myth," close quote. We still live surrounded by falsehood, much of it our own invention. Mr. McNamara's memoirs in retrospect serve us by starting to untwist some of these myths. One, that the war could have been won militarily, and two, that South Vietnam could have stood on its own. Harvard University has tried to address a problem that is raised throughout Mr. McNamara's memoirs, and that is the lack of real information and scholarship on Vietnam. 20 years after the fall of Saigon, this has not been an area of interest in many universities. Many courses are taught on the war, but few about the country as it is now. 7 years ago, as Graham said, I started a program here that deals with the government that won the war. For 7 years, unlike most American institutions, we have treated here Vietnam as a country and not as a war. Today, we have the largest academic exchange programs between the United States and Vietnam, and literally have hundreds of students and scholars from Vietnam studying throughout the country. Graham Allison can tell you the intrigue about getting our first student and how we used the visit of then Secretary of State George Shultz to get him a visa to come here. Next week, HID will have a groundbreaking in Saigon, where we will build the J. William Fulbright Teaching Center. Here will be conducted a series of executive training programs in a modified MPA program modeled after the curriculum of the Kennedy School. The current leadership of Vietnam visits this university regularly, and we treat them no different than if the Prime Minister of India or if the King of Thailand were to come. In this audience tonight, there are economists, government officials from Vietnam who work with us doing research in the search for policy options that will help the Vietnamese economy grow more rapidly and more equitably. Among our students here in Cambridge, we have the sons of the Vietnamese leadership, the daughters of their missing, the children of those who served in re-education camps. We have students from the Buddhist movement, the Cao Dai, and the National Liberation Front. Frankly, we have educated the coalition that Ngo Dinh Diem could never assemble. Harvard has accomplished something that the U.S. government and the American establishment have not done. We have treated Vietnam with respect. Vietnam, in turn, has sent us their best and their brightest. And we have been enriched here in this community by their presence. It has improved our understanding of Vietnam, of Asia, and of each other's values. In the preface of his book, Mr. McNamara almost destroys his important and honest assessment. with one sentence that makes me wonder. He says, "I truly believe that we made an error, not of values and intentions, but of judgment and capabilities," close quote. I, like many veterans, and I'm sure there are some here tonight, went to Vietnam as young men because we wanted to be like the generation before us who joined the American military to fight wars that did good. The Second World War stopped fascism and ended imperialism of Japan and Asia, and it was assumed that when America went to war, it went to do good. But if you used all the technology that was at my fingertips as a radio operator in Vietnam, and if you were brought up a Catholic, as I was, and learned when the state was wrong, you should resist and speak out, whether it be in Poland or in the United States. And if you bomb villages with children in them, you burn their houses, see prisoners given over to the South Vietnamese to be killed for fun, values were the problem. Our intentions were good. Our values became confused, lost, and that's why they won. But ironically, Vietnam has helped us learn for the first time that we can do wrong, and sometimes even evil, when our intentions were good. Our true understanding of this can make us a stronger country and help us limit future mistakes. Your memoirs, Mr. McNamara, contribute greatly to this understanding. Thank you.
We now turn from the panel to the audience. There are microphones on the ground floor here at the left and the right, and similarly, microphones, I think, here on the left and the right in the balcony. This event is taped for replay on public television and public radio, so please identify yourself and put your question. We're here to hear answers from the panel, so we ask you to limit your question to 1 minute. You can ask any question you want, but as long as it's brief, and we start here with this gentleman.
My name is Jed Weiss. I'm a sophomore at the college, and my question is for Secretary McNamara. I greatly appreciate you coming here tonight to set the record straight on Vietnam, and I admire your decision to write a book which admits some of the wrongdoing that the U.S. government did. But I have a question for you. What are happening to the proceeds of the book, and have you considered giving some of the proceeds to the families of those who died in Vietnam?
The answer is a number of veterans organizations have written to me about the programs that they are carrying out in relation to the veterans of Vietnam. I'm considering those. I don't know what I'm going to do with the proceeds. 2/3 of them have already gone in former research expenditures and so on. But whatever I do, I'm going to do privately. And I have a number of projects under consideration. I just don't know, and I can't answer the question. But when I do decide to do something, I'll do it privately, with the exception that certain kinds of gifts to charity are reported publicly, and to the degree that's the case, these will be reported publicly.
Okay, thank you.
Please, here on the right.
Good evening. My name is Thomas Flores. I'm a first year here at the college, and my question is for Secretary McNamara. What became known as the My Lai massacre galvanized public opinion against the Vietnam War effort. To the best of your knowledge, how often did massacres such as My Lai occur, and how high along the chain of command were such actions approved?
I can't answer your question. I think you've just heard Professor Valley say, and he didn't use this term, but I think it's what he was referring to, that there was, I'm going to call it indiscriminate fire. And I think while the My Lai massacre was a horrible thing, I really don't think that's the worst that happened. The worst thing that happened was, I've forgotten the term, Tom, you may remember, but I call it indiscriminate fire.
Friendly fire.
Pardon me?
Friendly fire?
No.
Free fire.
No, it was, yeah, it was free fire zones. Free fire zones is what, in effect, was involved. And it was just a horrible thing. And it certainly killed many, many more people than My Lai massacre things. But I do want to say one further word on this. There was some mention of morals by Professor Tai. I don't know how Harvard deals with this subject. I haven't had any association with academia on war for a long, long time, or foreign policy for that matter. I think my impression is that those that I meet across the world, have met across the world in some 40 years, 35 years of association with foreign policy and international relations and war, moral values rarely enter into the equation. And I think they should. And I don't think they did to some degree. There were, I'll call it overarching moral values that we were pursuing, that Professor Valley mentioned. But below that level, we justified what I'm going to call immoral acts in relation to the overarching values. And let me just give you one illustration. It doesn't happen to relate to Vietnam, but it's very much along the line of what you're talking about. I was on the island of Guam. There's been a lot of debate recently about nuclear weapons. This is the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And I was part of the unit, by the way, not of the unit that dropped the bomb, but I was part of the 20th Air Force, of which that was a unit. But I was on Guam in March of 1945. In one night, we killed 100,000 in Tokyo. They weren't uniformed. They were civilians. 100,000 in one night. I doubt any of you know that. It isn't even discussed. No, it makes my life look pale by significance. But that's what war is, at least the way it's been conducted. And if you go back and you think about dropping the bomb and you read about the debate over the Smithsonian exhibit, to this day we can't put that in what I would consider a proper moral context. And I know the answers have to be short. There are other questions, but I wish, and I hope you will, debate the morality of many of these issues, particularly those relating to nuclear. But let me stop there.
Okay, we're up here in the left balcony.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, my name is John Hurley. I'm a Vietnam veteran. And I have to tell you, sir, and there's no polite way to do this, your book and your presence is an obscenity. There comes a time, sir, when your intentions in going into Vietnam were quite right, were quite moral, were quite valued, and were respected by the entire country. But at some time, sir, your opinion on this war changed. And it may have been early. There are some reports that said you began to change your mind in December of 1963. Others that said you thought only a genocide could stop it in November of 1965, you said that. Stanley Carnow said you showed to him in February 1966 that you were changing. My question for you, sir, is that at the end of 1965, 1,425 American troops were dead. 1,425. 58,191 died before it was over. My friend, my commander, Bert Bunting, died in Vietnam. McNally never saw Wyoming. Alan Perot never saw a need of Massachusetts again. Sonny Davis didn't come home. They were torn to shreds. They were ripped apart. You ripped the soul out of the family of 58,191 families in this country, sir, and you remained silent. You said nothing. You let 30 years pass.
So now your question.
My question is, sir, why did Bert Bunting die when you knew the war was a mistake? Why did McNally die? Why did Kirkendall die? Why did they die, sir? Why did you remain silent while another 57,000 U.S. troops and 4 million Vietnamese die? Why?
Why did you resign?
You're going to have to read the book to get the answer. There's not time to answer.
Sir,
Wait a minute. Shut up.
I will.
Well, let's let him answer.
Now let
please.
me answer. You've had your time, you let me have mine. This is a very important question. Time isn't going to permit a complete answer. Get the book and read it and learn it. But the short answer is this. In 1965, the book points this out, I said to the President, Mr. President, I don't believe there's more than a 1 in 3 chance, certainly not at best more than a 1 in 2 chance to win this war militarily. And therefore, since you believe, Mr. President, and I believe, as Secretary Rusk wrote, and read what Rusk wrote, if we lose Vietnam, the Western world will face a catastrophic war, World War III. Now, I've said in the book, I think we were wrong. But if you believed that, we believed it at the time, and we weren't the only ones, by the way. There's a very interesting article. I don't want to get into all this, but you should read an article in the Washington Post written by Richard Harwood last week as to who believed this and who didn't, and when they changed their beliefs. And in '65, it was believed by the senior military officers and by the national intelligence estimators in the CIA and by the senior officials in the U.S. government and in many other Western governments that the loss of Vietnam to the communists would lose all of Asia and lead to a catastrophic war in Russ terms. As I say, I think we were wrong. So what we were trying to do was to use military pressure to move the North Vietnamese to negotiations to permit I'll call it an independent South Vietnam that would stop the advance of Chinese and Soviet communists. And that's why the war went on.
Can I have one more question, sir?
I think we have about 10 people.
Let him have another question.
Okay, a quick,
Thank
please, a quick question,
Thank
because there are a lot of people up.
The book may be well researched, sir. Where it lacks significantly is in the research of pain. The pain of families who have lost those 58,000 troops. I swear to God, sir, you have never looked in the face of a 20-year-old kid with more shrapnel wounds than you can count, never mind bandage. You've never wiped the sweat and dust from his face and looked him in the eye and said, you have to die for geopolitical considerations because we in Washington have deemed it necessary and deemed it over and over again. Pain, sir. You could take the proceeds of that book and you visit with Bert Bunting's widow and his girls. Go to Alan Perot's mother. Feel what they have lost. Understand it in your soul. And when you have, then you will have learned something, and then you can come back and teach us something about the lessons of Vietnam.
Let's just
short comment from, yes, thank you.
let's
Okay. Thank you for. Let's hear. We appreciate your comment, but you're not at the microphone, and we'll appreciate it if you'll respect the opinions of others and their opportunity to speak. Now, if you'll answer briefly, Tommy Valley wants to answer briefly, and there are a lot of other questions that people want to ask.
The question is an absolutely basic question, a perfectly appropriate question. And the answer is just as I suggest, that what we were dealing with was the fear of losing millions if we didn't stop the communists and the Chinese and Soviet advance.
Tommy, would you like to say something?
Just let me respond a little bit to this. Every person is very, very different. Not everyone, not everybody is born a leader. Not everybody knows how to speak out. I think there's a very important passage in Mr. McNamara's book where he says that he's terribly flawed about this. He didn't have the capacity to do what you asked. How much should we judge him about that? I think this book is an important part of what he's trying to do. The intentions of the book are fine. He was not a leader, and he admits it when he needed to be. And we accept that. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Here on the right-hand microphone in the balcony.
My name is James Williamson, and I became aware that there was something wrong with the war when I was 16 years old. I don't think I was necessarily particularly precocious, and I spoke up about it. I don't think it was particularly difficult to. I'd like to mention in passing that other people who were opposed to the war, Catherine Ann Power, turned herself in after living underground for 30 years or 25 years or so, after she had been involved in a misguided action to supposedly try to do something to end the war, and is now, where a police officer was killed, and is now spending 5 years in prison, and the judge ordered that she may not profit in any way from telling her story. I think I just want to put that on the table in terms of the question about the proceeds from your book. I thought the most important thing you said was that the Vietnamese leadership was prepared to kill another 3 million of their people. I can't believe that you mean that then the Americans who were killed in Vietnam were killed by our leaders. Unless that's what you mean, isn't it the responsibility in some very significant way of the leaders and decision makers of the United States that the hundreds of thousands and millions of Vietnamese were killed and died, and not the responsibility of their leaders?
I think that each leadership group carries responsibility for the killing of some of its people. I believe that the war could have been terminated much, much earlier than it had been, had each of us moved toward negotiations. And I, to this day, don't understand why that didn't come about. I mention in the book many occasions on which attempts were made to do that. And some of them failed. There's absolutely no question about it, because we were clumsy. You just can't believe how clumsy we were. In the middle of attempting to move toward very delicate negotiations, we'd carry out a bombing attack that they would interpret as intimidation. And how could they possibly be persuaded to move to negotiations when they believed that we were intimidating them, showing in a sense the strength that we would bring into the negotiation against presumably their weakness? So the efforts on both sides to move toward terminating the conflict, I think, existed, but weren't successful. And this is the kind of a world we're going to live in, where conflicts arise, and we must learn, A, how to prevent them, and B, how to terminate them when we're not successful. And the book points to those problems and suggests some answers.
Okay. Here,
I think you missed the point of the question.
please. Yeah. Here, the left microphone, please.
It's not on.
Yes,
Is it on now? Mr. McNamara, you don't know who I am, but you certainly, you poised a situation that created the rest of my adult life. My name is Maureen Dunn. I don't know if you remember the incident, February 14th, 1968, the China incident, where you, the President, the Vice President, Secretary Clifford, General Wheeler, General Taylor, Secretary McNamara, George Christian, Secretary Russ, Tom Johnson, and Walt Rostow met for 30 minutes about the China incident. Do you remember that?
No,
It was a pilot that was shot down over Hainan Island. Do you remember that incident?
I'm sorry, I don't.
Okay, well, the thing is, you, on page 6 of a top secret document that I received in 1992, when his beeper was heard when he was first shot down, and then 6.5 hours later was heard for 20 to 70 minutes. And you people sat there in that room for 45 minutes, never addressing his name. He was always the China incident. He was 25 years old. So you never had a face to see, or to know that he had a 25-year-old wife and a baby, a 1-year-old baby. This is very emotional for me. I didn't think I would be. But I'm that guy's wife. And you said on page 6, no rescue attempt should be made. Don't go after him. It's not worth it. And all these years, Mr. McNamara, I've wanted someone from those 10 people that were at that meeting to say to me, I am sorry. And I'd like you to say that in front of all these people to me, I am sorry. Please. I just want you to say, I am sorry.
I have no recollection of the meeting, and I can't
It's right
believe
here.
I understand what you
It's
have,
right
but I
here.
haven't seen it, and I'd like to see it. But let me just say this. If I said it, I'm not sorry, I'm horrified.
Well, just, I'd like
I'm
you to say to me,
absolutely-
I'm sorry,
Well, I'll
Maureen.
say I'm sorry, but that's not enough. I am absolutely horrified.
Well, it's right here, sir, on a
Well,
12-page
if
document.
you'll let me have that,
I
I'll take
certainly
it.
will.
I'll look
And
at
my
it.
son is here. He's 2 years younger than when it happened to my husband. He'd like to present you with a letter. Joe, would you do it, please? I waited 27 years for you to
May-
say that.
Could I have that copy? I'll get it back to you.
Okay, we're here on the right-hand microphone, please.
My name is Catherine Dunlop. I'm a sophomore at the college. I have two questions for Secretary McNamara.
How about one for as quickly as possible, please?
Oh, well,
If it's possible. Go ahead.
they're
quickly.
sort of linked.
Okay.
First of all, you make it apparent in your book that you feel that your involvement with the Vietnam War ended when you left your post as Secretary of Defense. It has, however, been suggested that you could have stopped the war after that, and there's some question as to why you felt no compulsion to take action to do so. Also, I wondered whether your attitude has changed towards American citizens who remained in this country but resisted involvement in the war.
I didn't hear the last question.
Your attitude towards Americans who remained in this country but resisted involvement in the war, whether that's changed over time.
But let me answer the first one, the last one first. I was in my publisher's office Friday last week, and Times Book publishes an author named David Harris. And David Harris was the president of the Stanford student body in 1967, was a leading protester against the war. He married Joan Baez, and he went to war. He went to prison in 1960. He served 2 years in prison. And I understood something about that. My son was at Stanford about that time, after I left the Defense Department. He was a protester. He wasn't sent to jail because he was drafted. He refused to request an educational deferment on the basis of privilege. He thought his peers were being killed, couldn't do it. He took a medical exam. He was classified 1A, but then they learned he had ulcers that came about from the tension in the family, and he was reclassified for F, so he didn't go. But Harris came up to me last Thursday, I guess it was, and he brought a book with him, and he wanted me to sign the book. And I signed the book. And he was very proud of what I said, because I said to an honorable American with admiration, and I believe it. Now, I think tonight we as Americans should recognize that not just the people in this room, and there have been some very moving statements made, but not just the people in this room, but hundreds of thousands of Americans suffered. And the question is, what do we do today? And I think there are two things we should do. One is we should try, as I suggest, to learn how it came about that these mistakes were made. Some of us don't agree there were mistakes. I think they were. That's the first thing we have to judge. Were there mistakes made? I think they were. I think certainly the majority of you believe there were mistakes made, but I think those who don't believe there were mistakes made need to study this matter further. We've got to start with a judgment of whether we were right or wrong, and then in the sense of the end, and then we have to think, how did it happen, and how can we prevent it in the future? And then we need to engage in a healing process. And I don't think anyone in this room has suffered more than a woman who wrote to me last week. A man, a Quaker, burned himself to death under my window in the Pentagon. His name was Morrison. His wife is Ann Morrison. She's remarried. Her name is Ann Morrison Welch. And she wrote to me last week and sent this letter, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there's one paragraph. She said, "To heal the wounds of that war, we must forgive ourselves and each other. I'm grateful to Robert McNamara for his courageous and honest reappraisal of the Vietnam War and his involvement in it. I hope his book will contribute to the healing process." Now, there's another document that came in last week, And this is the Newsweek article, and it was written by Colonel Hackworth. Colonel Hackworth fought in the Korean War. He was wounded 4 times in Vietnam. He was the youngest colonel in the Army at the time, the most decorated living Army person. He's resigned and discussed in 1972, 101 decorations. And he ends his article saying, McNamara's book is an important step toward understanding what happened, so we won't make the same mistakes again. And it may help some of the walking wounded to move farther along the healing path of forgiveness. And that's good for America's collective soul. So I leave those thoughts with you.
Okay. Gentleman here on the right.
Secretary McNamara, my name is John Edson, and I'm a second-year student here, and I'd like to ask you about the alleged naval incident in the Gulf of Tonkin in the early 1960s. A lot of people who've written on the Vietnam War speculate that you and the rest of the Johnson administration, once the decision was made to commit U.S. troops to Vietnam, needed a public incident to rally the Congress and the U.S. public generally to agree to commit troops there. A lot of people speculate that there's really no strategic motive for why the North Vietnamese would want to openly confront the U.S. Navy in the Gulf of Tonkin. And a lot of people believe that it was actually a CIA operation to create a public incident. And I realize some of this may be classified, and I'd like you to comment on it. If it's something that you believe that we were involved and we did stage it, I'd prefer if you just claim that it was classified and you can't talk about it.
No, I don't think there's anything classified about it that or should stay classified. I discuss it at great length. One whole chapter of the book is devoted to the Tonkin Gulf resolution for 2 reasons. One, because of the point you make, that it was, I'll call it provoked, or 2 views are, either it was provoked or it didn't happen. And in either case, it was not an appropriate justification for the Tonkin Gulf resolution. And I want to make a comment about that in a moment. But the incident was not provoked, I'll tell you that, at least not consciously provoked. It's a very complicated point. There were covert operations being carried on, totally unrelated to the electronic reconnaissance collection operations that involved a U.S. destroyer named the Maddox in the first incident and 2 destroyers, the Maddox and the Turner Joy in the second. And these 2 actions, one by covert operations run by the South Vietnamese, but with U.S. support, and the electronic reconnaissance were separate and were not, I'll call it, coordinated. And certainly there was no conscious provocation. In a sense, it wasn't necessary. We could have gotten a resolution without the damn incident, and as a matter of fact, had planned to do so. We were trying to let the civil rights legislation come to a vote before we went to the Congress on this resolution. But the incident came up first, so we went ahead. I've forgotten the exact dates. The incident occurred in August of '64. I think the civil rights legislation was planned to come forward in September. In any event, that came first. It was not provoked. There's still an argument about it. The pros and cons are presented in the book. I think the more important point is not whether it was provoked or not, because we would have gotten that resolution. But when we got it, if it hadn't been in association with that incident, it would have been, I think, quite a different form of resolution. At least there would not have been time pressure, and there would have been more debate. And I think there would have been more constraints in it. As it was, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was written to give full authority to the President to take the nation to war without any further discussion in the Congress. And that was known and recognized at the time. Bill Fulbright managed the floor debate, and he was asked by Senator John Cooper from Kentucky, Mr. Chairman, do I understand the resolution to give the President full power to take this nation to war in Indochina? And Bill Fulbright said yes. But it was never the intention of Congress that it be used that way. And it was never the intention at the time of President Johnson that he would use it that way. And yet it was used that way. And that was the error. of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, not the events that brought it about. There would have been I'll call it a Tonkin Gulf Resolution, a resolution of authority to commit U.S. forces to combat in Southeast Asia without any question before the end of that year, regardless of the debate. I think, regardless of the Tonkin Gulf incident, I think, however, that had it occurred without that incident, it would have been more thoughtfully debated, and as I suggest, I think there would have been written into the resolution constraints that were implicit but never acted upon.
With apologies to Professor Watkins and a number of the rest of you who are up, I'm going to call on a member of the audience, Ken Galbraith, for the last comment or question, if he'll come up and offer whatever suggestions.
This is enormously, sadly in conflict with my normally retiring nature. I think I perhaps can claim that I have some anti-Vietnam credentials of the safer sort. I was sent to Vietnam in 1961 after I had expressed to the president strong objections to what was that time the rather famous Rostow-Taylor report, saying that we should send troops into the Vietnam Delta disguised as flood control workers. I protested the idea of sending troops even in disguise, and Kennedy said, well, you go to Vietnam. His impression was that I didn't have an open mind, and I didn't disappoint him. I came back with a report and a series of letters that are later being published by the Harvard University Press this year, and will undoubtedly outsell McNamara. All of which entered objection to our involvement there on several grounds. First, as I had the sense that I had from India that we were more involved as enemies of Vietnam nationalism, something that they understood from the ancient Chinese, the ancient French, the older French, and the recent Japanese experience, that they understood the intervention of a seeming colonial power much better than they understood the difference between communism and democracy. I was particularly impressed, as I've often told, about a Sunday with an armed escort. We went many miles north of Saigon. And that Sunday was a very strongly educational experience for me, because I saw and sensed the enormous difficulty of telling a communist jungle from a democratic jungle. You would be astonished at how alike they were. I went on to argue inside the administration in a distant way. I don't want to exaggerate my role. And then on to the anti-war movement. I was one of the leaders of Gene McCarthy's campaign, put his name in nomination at the Great Chicago Convention, was his floor manager under circumstances where it was not evident that anybody in that particular gathering was taking my management. And so I think that even the most energetic and motivated people here this wonderful evening will forgive me. And I want to, on the basis of that record, say a word about Robert McNamara. During all of this time, he was the one person to whom we had access. He was the one person who would talk, whom we hoped on occasion we could persuade. I think that he was open to the kind of persuasion which came not from me, but from others similarly motivated. And we see this evening a remarkable man who has gone back over that period. Something we must also emphasize, the extraordinary research that was done, already mentioned by my colleagues. A good piece of writing and of compelling lesson. I was particularly struck, Bob, by the seemingly narrow margin that we sometimes were facing on the use of nuclear weapons. This, I must say, was in an extraordinary extent new to me from your book. So I want, with many others here this evening, to add my word of admiration for this wonderful piece of research, this remarkable piece of research, this extraordinarily good writing, and the compelling lesson which it conveys. And I do that partly in response to an old friend, but partly in response to the criticism that Bob McNamara could have avoided if, like so many others, he had opted for silence. Thank you.
Well, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank especially Robert McNamara, and I want to thank you for an illuminating evening. We hope that Bob McNamara will come back soon. Thank you very much. Good. Great. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you.